Mountain Man paid for a pregnant widow to cook for him, but received a woman who taught him grace. The mountain town of Pine Ridge sat quietly between tall pine trees and long winding roads that few people traveled unless they had a reason. Winter had already begun to show its strength. The air was sharp, and the ground carried a thin layer of frost that never fully melted, even when the sun came out. Most people in town kept their heads down and their lives small. Everyone knew everyone, but no one really knew anyone deeply. Caleb Harlan lived far from the center of town, up a narrow dirt road that climbed into the hills. His cabin stood alone among the trees, built by his own hands years ago when life had felt fuller. But now it was just a quiet place that echoed with memories. The walls still held the sound of laughter that once filled the rooms, but Caleb no longer heard it. He woke up, worked, ate, and slept in silence. That was the way he had learned to survive. Caleb was a man who didn't talk much. He had a strong build from years of chopping wood and fixing fences, and his face looked older than his age because the sun and cold had carved lines into his skin. He went into town only when he had to, usually for supplies. The people at the general store nodded at him, but no one tried to start a long conversation. They all knew he preferred it that way. One cold morning, Caleb stood in front of the small corkboard near the store's entrance. It was covered with notes, some offering odd jobs, others asking for help or selling old furniture. He pulled a small piece of paper from his coat pocket. His hands hesitated for a moment before he pinned it up. The note was simple, best. It said he needed someone to cook and help keep his cabin in order during the winter. He would pay in cash. Bare. No extra details. No personal words. Just business. He didn't look back at the note as he walked away. To him, it was just another task to handle, like stacking firewood or fixing a broken step. Across town, Elena Brooks sat on a narrow bed in a small rented room above the old bakery. The room was warm, but her life felt cold. Her husband had passed away months earlier in a work accident, leaving her alone and carrying their child. The little savings they had were almost gone. She had tried finding work, but many people hesitated when they saw her growing belly and tired eyes. She placed one hand over her stomach, feeling the gentle movement of the baby. "I'll figure this out," she whispered, though she wasn't sure how. Later that day, she walked slowly down Main Street, her boots worn and her coat thin. She passed the general store and noticed the cork board. Something made her stop. She stepped closer and began reading the notes. When her eyes landed on Caleb's paper, she felt a small spark of hope. It wasn't a perfect job. It was far from town, and the winter would be hard. But it was work, and it was honest. She took a deep breath, pulled the note down, and folded it carefully into her pocket. The next morning, Elena stood at the edge of the dirt road that led into the hills. A neighbor had offered to drive her part of the way. The rest, she would walk. The trees grew thicker as she moved forward, and the air became even colder. Each step felt heavier, but she kept going. When she finally reached the cabin, she paused. It was sturdy, built from thick logs, with smoke rising gently from the chimney. It looked like a place that had once been filled with care but now stood quiet, like it was waiting for something to return. She knocked on the door. Caleb opened it after a moment. His eyes widened slightly when he saw her. He had expected someone older, maybe a man, or a strong woman, who looked like they could handle mountain life easily. Instead, there stood a young woman, clearly pregnant, with tired eyes but a steady look. "I saw your note," Elena said softly. Narration. I can cook and clean. I don't need much, just fair pay. Caleb studied her, unsure what to say. His first thought was that this was a mistake. Bay. The mountain was no place for someone in her condition. But he also saw something else. Determination. You know this place is far from town, he said, and winter's only getting worse. I know, she replied. Bay, but I can work, and I need the job. He stepped aside and let her in. The cabin was simple. A wooden table, 2 chairs, a small kitchen area, and a fireplace that kept the room warm. The walls were clean but bare, as if anything that once held meaning had been removed.
Elena noticed the silence right away. It wasn't just quiet. It felt heavy.
Caleb explained the arrangement in short sentences. He would pay her each week. She would cook meals and keep the place clean. She could stay in the small room at the back of the cabin. That's all, he said. Elena nodded. That's fine. She set down her bag and went to look at the kitchen. The shelves were nearly empty, and the tools were old but usable. Narration. She smiled slightly. We can make this work, she said, mostly to herself. That evening she cooked a simple meal from what little he had. When she placed the plate in front of him, Caleb hesitated. He hadn't shared a meal with anyone in a long time. He sat down and ate quietly. The food was warm, and for the first time in months the cabin felt different. Not alive, exactly, but less empty. Elena sat across from him, eating slowly. She didn't try to fill the silence with words. She had learned that sometimes quiet people needed space, not questions. After dinner, Caleb handed her the first payment. Bare. She thanked him, her voice gentle. That night, as Elena lay in the small back room, she stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind outside. The cabin creaked softly as the cold pressed against the walls. She felt scared, but also relieved. She had a place to stay, a way to earn, a chance to keep going. In the other room, Caleb sat by the fire, staring into the flames. Breath. He told himself this was just business, a simple deal. But as he thought about the quiet strength in Elena's eyes, he felt something shift inside him, something he wasn't ready to name. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, carrying the promise of a long winter ahead. Bay. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives had just crossed in a way that would change them both, slowly and quietly, like snow falling on the mountain. Morning came slowly to the mountain, like it had to push its way through the cold before it could reach the cabin. Bay. Pale light slipped in through the small windows, touching the wooden floor and the rough walls. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving only soft red coals behind. The air inside was cool, but not uncomfortable. Elena woke up before the sun fully rose. She lay still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the forest. The wind brushed against the trees, and somewhere far away, a bird called out. She placed her hand on her belly and felt the baby move gently, like a small reminder that she wasn't alone, even in this quiet place. She carefully sat up, pulling on her sweater and boots. The small room she slept in was simple, with a narrow bed, a wooden chair, and a small shelf for her bag. It wasn't much, but it felt safe. Beth. She took a deep breath and stepped out into the main room. Caleb was already awake. Ration. He sat at the table, cleaning a tool with slow, steady movements. He looked up when he heard her footsteps and gave a short nod. Morning, he said. Good morning, Elena replied, her voice soft but warm.
She went straight to the kitchen area and began looking through the supplies.
There wasn't much, but she knew how to make something out of very little. She mixed flour and water to make simple bread and warmed up some beans on the stove. A smell of food slowly filled the cabin, pushing away the cold feeling of the early morning. Caleb watched from his chair. He didn't say anything, but he noticed how she moved with care. Even when she looked tired, she didn't rush. She didn't complain. She just worked. When breakfast was ready, she placed a plate in front of him and sat down across the table. They ate quietly. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft clink of utensils on plates. After the meal, Caleb stood and grabbed his coat.
"I'll be gone most of the day," he said. "There's wood to cut down the slope."
Ellen nodded. "I'll clean up and see what else needs doing." He hesitated for a moment, then said, "Don't try to lift anything heavy." She gave a small smile.
"I won't."
When the door closed behind him, the cabin felt different. It was quiet, but not as heavy as before. Elena rolled up her sleeves and began cleaning. She wiped down the table, swept the floor, and opened the curtains to let in more light. Dust danced in the air as the sunlight poured through the windows. As she worked, she noticed small signs of the life Caleb used to have: a faded picture frame on a shelf, a pair of gloves placed neatly by the door, a blanket folded carefully on a chair. These weren't things left behind in carelessness. They were things someone had once cared about deeply. She picked up the picture frame and gently wiped off the dust. Inside was a photo of a younger Caleb standing next to a woman with a bright smile. They were both holding a fishing pole standing by a river. Elena felt a quiet understanding. This was the woman who had filled this house with life before. She placed the frame back where she found it. Later in the morning, she stepped outside for some fresh air. The cold touched her cheeks, but the view took her breath away. The mountains stretched out in every direction, covered in tall trees and soft white frost. The world felt big and quiet, like it was holding its breath. She walked slowly around the cabin, making sure the steps were clear of ice. She gathered small branches for kindling and stacked them neatly by the door. Each movement was careful, measured. She listened to her body, resting when she needed to. By the time Caleb returned in the afternoon, the cabin smelled clean and warm. A pot of soup simmered on the stove, and fresh bread rested on the table, covered with a cloth. He stopped just inside the door, surprised by the sight. The place looked brighter. Not new, but cared for.
"You didn't have to do all this," he said.
Elena shrugged gently. "I wanted to." They ate lunch together. This time, the silence felt different. It wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, like two people sharing space without needing to fill it with words. As the days passed, a quiet rhythm formed between them. Caleb worked outside, fixing fences, cutting wood, and checking traps. Elena stayed inside, cooking, cleaning, and slowly bringing small touches of warmth into the cabin. She placed a simple cloth on the table. She set the chairs just a little closer together. She even found a small wildflower one day and put it in a jar by the window. Breath. Caleb noticed these things, even if he didn't say so. He found himself sitting at the table longer after meals. He started looking forward to the smell of food when he came back from the cold. The cabin no longer felt like just a place to sleep, but it felt like a home again. Even if only a little. One evening, as the sky turned pink and gold outside the window, Elena sat by the fire, sewing a small piece of fabric. Bess. Caleb watched from his chair. "What are you making?" he asked. She looked up, surprised by the question. "A blanket for the baby," she said. "Just something simple." He nodded. "That's nice." They sat quietly for a while. Then, without meaning to, Caleb spoke again. "My wife used to sit right there," he said, pointing to the spot by the fire. "She liked the warmth." Elena didn't rush to answer. "She sounds like she was kind," she said softly. He swallowed and looked into the flames. She was. That was all he said, but it was more than he had shared in a long time. Later that night, a strong wind rose outside. The cabin shook slightly as the storm began to move in. Elena felt a wave of worry. She had never been through a mountain storm before. Caleb noticed her tense. "The cabin's strong," he said. "It's been through worse." She nodded, trusting his calm voice. As the wind howled and snow began to fall, they sat together by the fire, not speaking. But not alone either. The storm raged outside, but inside the warmth held. Elena felt tired but safe. Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. The mountain, covered in snow and shadow, stood quietly around them, watching as two lonely lives slowly, gently began to change. Not through grand moments, but through small, steady acts of care, day by day. The storm did not leave after one night. It stayed, like it had decided to make the mountain its home. Snow fell without stopping, covering the trees, the ground, and the narrow road that led down to town. The world outside the cabin became a soft white blur, and the sky stayed gray even during the day. Inside, the cabin felt smaller than before. Elena woke up on the second morning of the storm with a strange tight feeling in her chest. The air felt heavier, and her body felt tired in a way she couldn't explain. Breath. She sat up slowly, breathing carefully, and waited for the feeling to pass. When it did, she stood and wrapped her sweater tighter around herself. She stepped into the main room and saw Caleb already adding wood to the fire. He looked tired, too, with dark circles under his eyes. "The road's gone," he said quietly. "Can't even see where it was." Elena nodded. "So we're stuck for a while." "Looks like it." They moved through the morning slowly. Elena tried to prepare breakfast, but her hands felt shaky. She dropped a spoon on the floor and had to sit down for a moment to catch her breath. Caleb noticed. "You all right?" he asked. "I think so," she said, though her voice didn't sound sure. Bare. He pulled a chair closer to the fire and helped her sit. "Rest a bit. I can handle the food." She looked at him, surprised. You don't have to." "I know," he said, "but I will." He wasn't good in the kitchen, but he tried. Bray. The bread came out uneven and the soup was too thin. But Elena smiled and thanked him anyway. The small act meant more to her than the meal itself. As the day went on, the storm grew louder. The wind pushed against the walls, and snow hit the windows like tiny stones. Elena stayed close to the fire, sewing when she could, resting when she had to. At one point, a sharp pain moved through her side, making her gasp. Caleb stood up quickly. "What is it?" he asked, worry clear in his voice. "I don't know," she said softly. "It comes and goes." He sat back down, closer this time. If it gets worse, we'll figure something out. She nodded, grateful for his calm. The hours passed slowly. With nowhere to go and nothing to do outside, they were forced to share the space, the silence, and the sound of the storm together. Caleb stared at the fire, his thoughts drifting to the past. He hadn't planned to talk about it, but the words came anyway. "My wife hated storms like this," he said. She used to count the seconds between thunder and lightning, said it made her feel in control. Elena smiled gently. "Did it work?" "Sometimes," he said. Mostly she just laughed when she got the count wrong. He paused, then added, "After she passed, I stopped lighting the fire as much. The quiet felt easier than remembering."
Elena looked at him. "But you still light it now."
He nodded. "Yeah. Guess I do." The storm outside grew stronger, but inside something softened between them. They began to talk more. Not about big things, but small ones. Where Elena grew up, the bakery that used to be in town. The river where Caleb and his wife used to fish. Their words were simple, but each one built a small bridge between their lonely worlds. Bay. That night, the wind reached its loudest. The cabin shook, and the fire flickered wildly. Baz. Elena tried to sleep, but the noise and the tight feeling in her body kept her awake. She finally stood and walked into the main room. Caleb was still there, sitting by the fire, as if he hadn't moved all night. "Can't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Feels like the storm's inside me, too." He stood and gently placed another log on the fire. "Sit," he said, pointing to the chair near the warmth. She did, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. They sat there in quiet, watching the flames dance. The light painted soft shadows on the walls. Desk. After a long moment, Elena spoke.
"I'm scared sometimes," she admitted.
"Not just about the baby. About being alone. About not being enough." Caleb listened carefully. "I've been alone a long time," he said. "Turns out, it just makes them colder." She looked at him, surprised by his honesty. "I don't know much about babies," he added, "or about fixing broken hearts, but I know how to keep a fire going, even when it feels like it's about to go out." Elena felt her eyes fill, but she smiled. "That might be enough." The next morning, the storm began to calm. The wind softened, and the snow fell more gently, like the mountain was finally getting tired. Elena woke up feeling weak but hopeful. She stepped outside for a moment, careful not to slip on the ice. The world looked different now. Clean. Basis. Quiet. Still. Caleb joined her, standing a few steps away. "We'll clear the path when it's safe," he said. "Get you back to town if you need." She shook her head. "Not yet." He looked at her, curious, but didn't push. They went back inside, and Elena sat at the table, slowly working on the small blanket again. Caleb watched her, feeling something unfamiliar in his chest. Not pain, not sadness. Something lighter. Later that day, Elena felt another sharp pain. This one was stronger. She grabbed the edge of the table. Pear. Caleb was at her side in seconds. "Sit down," he said firmly. Bess. She did, breathing slowly. It passed, she said after a moment. But it's getting closer together. He nodded, his face serious. We're not taking chances. As soon as the road's clear enough, we go. That night, neither of them slept much.
Caleb kept the fire burning and listened for every sound Elena made. She rested as best she could, feeling tired but comforted by knowing she wasn't alone.
But by morning, the storm had finally moved on. The sky showed small patches of blue, and the world felt calm again. Narration. They stood at the door, looking out at the snow-covered path.
Looks like the mountain's given us a break,
Caleb said. Elena smiled weakly. Guess so. They didn't know what the road ahead would bring. But as they stood there, side by side, facing the quiet world together, both felt something new growing between them. Not just trust. Not just kindness. Something like hope, steady and warm, like a fire that refused to go out even in the coldest storm. The road down the mountain was still covered in snow, but Caleb worked through the morning, clearing a narrow path with his shovel and boots. Each step was slow and careful. The air was cold and sharp, and his hands burned from the effort, but he didn't stop. He kept glancing back at the cabin, where Elena stood in the doorway, wrapped in a thick coat, and watching him. By midday, the path was just wide enough for them to walk. Caleb packed a small bag with food, water, and a blanket. He handed it to Elena.
We'll take it slow, he said. If you need to rest, we stop. She nodded. Thank you. They started down the path together.
The world was quiet after the storm. Snow rested on every branch, and the sky was pale blue, like it hadn't fully woken up yet. Their boots left deep marks in the snow, the only sign that anyone had passed through this place in days. Elena moved carefully, one hand on her belly and the other holding Caleb's arm when the ground became slippery. He stayed close, steady and calm, making sure each step was safe. It took longer than usual to reach the edge of town. But when they finally did, people began to notice them. A few heads turned. A few whispers followed. In a small town like Pine Ridge, nothing went unseen for long. Some people recognized Elena. They remembered her from the bakery and from the quiet walks she used to take with her husband. Seeing her now, walking beside Caleb, sparked quiet talk among the onlookers. Caleb felt it. He felt the eyes, the silent questions. His shoulders tensed. But he didn't let go of Elena's arm. They stopped at the small clinic near the center of town. The nurse on duty hurried them inside and helped Elena sit down. The warmth of the room felt almost overwhelming after the cold outside.
"You did the right thing coming in," the nurse said kindly, checking Elena's pulse and breathing.
Breath. Caleb stood nearby, hands in his pockets, unsure where to look or what to do. He had never been in this place before, not for anything like this. The quiet beeping of a small machine and the soft voices in the hallway made him feel out of place. After a while, the nurse smiled. "She's tired and stressed, but everything looks okay for now. She needs rest and support." Elena let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding.
Caleb nodded. She can stay at my place.
"I'll make sure she rests." The nurse looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "That's good to hear." They stepped back outside and the whispers began again. A woman near the store shook her head. A man by the post office leaned toward a friend and spoke quietly. Elena noticed. Her shoulders drooped slightly. Caleb stopped walking. He turned and looked around at the people watching them. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. She's under my care. Beck, that's all you need to know. The talking stopped. People looked away, passed. But Elena felt something change. She looked at Caleb with a mix of surprise and gratitude. Bess. Thank you, she said softly as they continued walking. He shrugged. No one gets to decide what's right for you, but you. The walk back up the mountain felt longer. Elena was tired, and Caleb could feel the weight of her leaning on him more with each step. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was starting to set, painting the sky in soft orange and pink. Inside, the warmth of the fire greeted them. Bare. Caleb helped Elena sit down and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Rest, he said.
I'll handle everything else, she smiled. You already do more than you think. That night, Elena slept deeply.
Caleb stayed up, sitting by the fire, listening to the steady sound of her breathing from the back room. He thought about the looks in town, the words he had spoken without thinking, and how natural it had felt to stand up for her. He realized something then. This was no longer just a deal. It hadn't been for a while. The next few days passed quietly. Elena rested more. Caleb cooked simple meals and brought them to her, always checking to make sure she was comfortable. The cabin, once silent and empty, now felt full of small, gentle sounds. The crackle of the fire, the soft hum of Elena's voice as she spoke to her baby, the steady footsteps of Caleb moving around the room. One afternoon, Elena sat by the window watching the snow melt from the trees. "Do you ever think about leaving this place?" she asked. Caleb thought for a moment. "I used to. Desperate. Thought I might go somewhere warm, somewhere new." "And now?" she asked. He looked around the cabin. Now I think this place still has some life left in it." She smiled. "I think so too." A few days later, a knock came at the door. Caleb opened it to find a woman from town standing there holding a basket.
"I brought some food,"
she said awkwardly. "For Elena. Thought it might help." Caleb hesitated, then stepped aside. "Thank you." The woman set the basket down and gave Elena a small smile before leaving. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next week, a few more people came by. A jar of jam, a stack of clean cloth, a simple note wishing Elena well. The whispers in town began to fade, replaced by quiet understanding. One evening, as snow began to fall again, Caleb and Elena sat by the fire.
"I didn't expect any of this,"
Elena said. "Not the cabin. Not you. Not the way things turned out." Caleb nodded.
"Neither did I!"
She looked at him.
"I don't know what the future looks like,
but I know I'm not as scared as I used to be." He met her eyes. "You don't have to face it alone." The words hung in the air, simple but strong. That night, the wind picked up outside, but inside the fire burned steady. The cabin stood firm against the cold, and so did the two people inside it. Somewhere between the storm, the road to town, and the quiet days that followed, something had changed, but in the soft, steady way that truly lasting things often grow. And as the mountain watched over them, Covered in snow and silence, it seemed to hold a quiet promise of what was still to come. The morning light came softly through the window, touching the walls of the cabin with a warm glow. The snow outside had begun to melt in small patches, revealing dark earth and fallen pine needles beneath. The air felt different now. It still held the chill of winter, but there was something lighter in it, like the mountain itself was slowly waking up. Eleanor stood near the window, one hand resting on her belly, watching a bird hop across the snow. She smiled at the simple sight. It reminded her that life kept moving forward, even after storms, even after loss. Caleb sat at the table, fixing a loose leg on one of the chairs. Bet. He worked carefully, but his eyes often drifted toward Elena. Over the past weeks, she had become a steady part of his world. Her presence filled the cabin in a way he never expected, not with noise, but with quiet warmth. "Breakfast is almost ready," Elena said, turning back toward the stove. "I can help," Caleb replied, standing up. She shook her head gently. "You already did enough fixing for one morning." He smiled. A small one, but real. They ate together as they always did now, side by side, looking out the window at the mountain. The silence between them felt comfortable, like a shared understanding rather than empty space. Later that day, Elena felt a familiar tightness in her body, stronger than before. She paused, holding on to the edge of the table. "Bear." Caleb noticed right away. "Is it happening?" he asked quietly. "Breath." She took a slow breath. "I think so." He didn't panic. He moved with calm purpose, grabbing the bag he had kept ready near the door. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and helped her stand. Breath. "We'll go to town," he said. Slow and steady. The walk felt longer than any before. Elena leaned on Caleb more, and he matched her pace, never rushing, never letting her feel alone. The mountain path, once cold and quiet, now felt like a road leading forward, not just down. When they reached the clinic, the nurse hurried them inside. Caleb waited nearby, sitting on a hard chair in the hallway. He stared at the floor, his hands resting on his knees. Time moved strangely there, slower and faster at the same time. When the door finally opened, the nurse smiled at him. "Everything went well," she said. "You can come in." Caleb stood, his heart beating harder than it had in years. He stepped into the room and saw Elena resting on the bed, tired but smiling. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blanket, was the baby. Caleb stopped just inside the doorway. He didn't move for a moment. Elena looked at him. "Do you want to meet her?" she asked gently. He walked forward, slow and careful, like he was stepping into something fragile and important. He looked down at the small face, the tiny hands, the quiet rise and fall of the baby's chest. "She's beautiful," he said softly. Elena's eyes filled with tears. "Her name is Grace." Caleb nodded. The name felt right. It felt like everything that had brought them to this moment. They returned to the cabin a few days later. The mountain greeted them with soft snow and quiet air. Inside, the fire burned warm, and the small room at the back now held a new cradle Caleb had built himself while Elena rested in town. Life in the cabin changed, but in gentle ways. The quiet was still there, but now it was mixed with soft sounds. The baby's small breaths, Elena's low humming, Caleb's footsteps as he moved carefully through the room. The town noticed, too. When Caleb went down for supplies, people asked how Elena and the baby were doing. Some even sent small gifts.
A knitted blanket. A basket of food. Simple signs of care. One afternoon, Elena sat outside on a wooden bench, Grace sleeping in her arms. The sun warmed her face, and the air smelled of pine and fresh snow.
"I don't know what I would have done without you," she said to Caleb, who was chopping wood nearby. He stopped and leaned on the handle of the axe.
"Pen, I could say the same." She looked at him. "I don't want to stay here because I have nowhere else to go."
"I want to stay because this feels like home." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest, not with sadness, but with something close to joy.
"I'd like that," he said, "if you and Grace stay. They didn't make big promises."
They didn't talk about what things would look like years from now. They simply agreed to keep going, together, one day at a time. Base. As spring slowly approached, the mountain began to change. Snow melted into small streams. Birds returned to the trees. The world outside the cabin grew greener and brighter. Inside, life grew too. Elena planted a small garden near the cabin, bare.
Caleb fixed the fence around it. Grace grew stronger each day, her small hands reaching for the light that came through the window.
One evening they sat together by the fire, just like they had during the storm that first brought them closer.
"I used to think this place was where my life ended,"
Caleb said quietly.
"Now I think it's where it started again."
Elena smiled. Sometimes the hardest places become the kindest ones. The fire crackled softly. Grace slept between them, wrapped in the small blanket Elena had sewn during the long winter nights.
Outside, the mountain stood tall and steady, watching over the cabin, the garden, and the small family inside.
There were still hard days ahead. They both knew that. Life didn't become easy just because hearts grew warmer. But they also knew they wouldn't face those days alone. As the stars appeared in the sky, Caleb stepped outside for a moment. He looked up at the wide, quiet world above him. He felt grateful, not for big changes or sudden miracles, but for the simple grace of shared meals, shared worries, and shared hope. When he went back inside, Elena looked up at him and smiled. "Everything okay?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, everything's good."